It was early morning in downtown Los Angeles, and the sun was barely beginning to rise, casting a soft orange hue across the city. Amid the quiet hum of the city's awakening, a young boy named Jimmy sat huddled on the cold sidewalk. His small frame was wrapped in a torn, threadbare coat that barely protected him from the chill. The streets were bustling with early commuters, their busy lives unfolding before him, but to Jimmy, they felt like a distant world he could never reach. Jimmy wasn't like the other kids who had a warm bed to sleep in at night or parents who cared for them. He had been living on the streets for almost a year now, ever since the tragic accident that took both of his parents' lives. His world had been shattered in a split second when a reckless driver collided with the family car, leaving Jimmy alone, grieving, and without anyone to turn to. At first, he had tried to stay with distant relatives, but they didn't want him. Too much of a burden, too much of a reminder of a past they wished to forget. So, Jimmy had wandered, finding shelter wherever he could, whether it was a cold bench in a park or a forgotten alley behind a closed business. He knew the streets better than any school. He had learned the hard way that to survive, he had to be strong, fast, and always on the lookout. Every day was a battle, not just for food, but for dignity. His stomach growled with hunger, a familiar feeling that gnawed at him. He hadn't eaten much the day before. A few discarded sandwiches, a half-eaten granola bar, and the last of the warm coffee from a kind soul who had shared their cup with him. But that had been hours ago, and the hunger was becoming unbearable. As he sat on the cold pavement, Jimmy's eyes scanned the people walking by. Most ignored him, their eyes deliberately looking away as if he were invisible. But there were a few who looked down with brief sympathy, before quickly turning away, as if feeling uncomfortable with the sight of a child living on the streets. Jimmy had grown used to this kind of treatment. He had learned that people didn't want to get involved, didn't want to help. Everyone had their own lives to live. But today, something felt different. As he gazed up the street, he noticed a sleek black car pulling up to the curb. It was unmistakably expensive, the kind of car that people with power and wealth drove. The door opened, and out stepped a man who, at first, seemed like just another successful businessman. He wore a suit that looked freshly pressed, his shoes shining even in the early morning light. But there was something about him, something that caught Jimmy's eye. The man's presence seemed to radiate energy, authority, and a certain warmth, despite his polished exterior. Jimmy didn't know who this man was. He only knew that he was someone who had more than Jimmy could ever dream of. And yet, as the man walked past him, their eyes met. For a brief moment, the world seemed to slow down. Jimmy felt his heart race. He had no idea why he suddenly felt compelled to speak, but before he could stop himself, the words tumbled out. "Excuse me, sir, could you spare some food?" His voice cracked with a mix of desperation and shame. He wasn't used to asking for help, but today, the hunger was too overwhelming. It hurt to say the words, but he had no other choice. The man stopped in his tracks, his eyes meeting Jimmy's. There was a long silence, and for a second, Jimmy felt like the man was about to just walk away. But then, to his surprise, the man knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the young boy. Jimmy blinked, confused by the sudden attention. The man's face softened, his eyes showing something that Jimmy hadn't expected, empathy, understanding. "Are you hungry?" the man asked, his voice gentle but firm. Jimmy nodded, his throat tightening. "Yes, sir. I haven't eaten much today." The man didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp bill, enough for a meal at a nearby diner. But as he extended the money to Jimmy, he seemed to think for a moment, his gaze shifting from the boy to the street around them. Jimmy could see the wheels turning in his mind. "Come with me," the man said, standing up and extending his hand. Jimmy stared at the man's hand for a moment, unsure of what to do. He wasn't used to people offering their help without expecting something in return. But there was something different about this man, something that made Jimmy feel like he could trust him. Where are we going?" Jimmy asked, his voice small. "Let's get you something to eat first," the man replied with a warm smile. "And then, I want to talk to you." Jimmy hesitated for a moment. He had been taught to be wary of strangers, especially those who seemed too kind. But there was something in the man's eyes that made him feel like he was safe. After all, what did he have to lose? "Okay," Jimmy finally said, taking the man's hand. As they walked together, Jimmy couldn't help but wonder who this man was. Why was he helping him? He had seen so many wealthy people in the city, but none of them had ever stopped to give him a second glance. This man, though, was different. They walked a few blocks, passing by upscale stores and restaurants, until they reached a small, but surprisingly inviting diner. The kind of place where the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon greeted you as you stepped through the door. Jimmy's stomach growled loudly as they entered, and he could feel the warmth of the restaurant fill him with a sense of comfort he hadn't felt in months. The man guided Jimmy to a booth in the corner, where a waitress quickly came over to take their order. The man ordered a hearty breakfast, and Jimmy found himself unable to choose. Everything on the menu sounded like a dream. The man smiled and turned to Jimmy, his eyes thoughtful. "Go ahead," he said. "Order whatever you like." For the first time in a long while, Jimmy felt something close to joy stir in his chest. He hesitated for a moment, then pointed to a plate of pancakes, eggs, and bacon. "That one," Jimmy said, his voice small but filled with hope. The man nodded, signaling the waitress to place the order. As they sat in the cozy booth, the man began asking Jimmy about his life, his family, and what had led him to the streets. Jimmy wasn't sure why he was opening up to a stranger, but there was something about the man that made it feel safe to do so. "What's your name?" the man asked, his eyes kind but curious. "Jimmy," the boy replied quietly. "I used to live with my mom and dad. But, they're gone now." The man's expression softened as he listened intently. He didn't interrupt, just let Jimmy speak. For the first time in a long while, Jimmy felt heard, understood. As their breakfast arrived, the man smiled at Jimmy. "You're not alone, Jimmy. There's always hope. Things can change. I promise you." Jimmy looked at him, unsure of what he meant, but in that moment, he wanted to believe it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The warm steam rising from the freshly cooked pancakes, the sizzle of bacon, and the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, grounding Jimmy in a reality that felt surreal. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he wasn't thinking about where his next meal would come from or where he would sleep that night. He was sitting in a cozy diner, in a booth with a stranger who, for reasons unknown to Jimmy, had decided to show him kindness. The man in the suit, Jimmy still hadn't asked his name, watched him carefully as he cut into the fluffy pancakes. Jimmy was so hungry that the first bite tasted like heaven. The food melted in his mouth, and he couldn't help but close his eyes for a moment, savoring the taste. It was as if the entire world had slowed down, and for once, his hunger didn't feel like it was eating him from the inside out. "I've never had pancakes this good," Jimmy said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and contentment. He didn't mean to sound like a child, but he couldn't help it. It had been so long since he'd eaten anything that tasted this good. The man smiled, clearly pleased to see Jimmy enjoying the meal. He sipped his coffee before replying, "You deserve it, Jimmy. You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Jimmy looked up at him, startled by the gentle tone. How did this man know? Was it obvious? He nodded slowly, his mind briefly flashing back to the memories of his life before the accident. He thought about the days spent with his parents, the laughter, the warmth of their home, and how everything had been ripped away from him in an instant. The thought of it made his throat tighten. "My parents, they were in a car crash," Jimmy said, the words slipping out of him more easily than he thought they would. Maybe it was the warmth of the diner, the kind voice of the man across from him, or the comfort of the food in his stomach, but Jimmy felt safe enough to speak. "I'm sorry to hear that," the man said softly, his voice sincere. "It must be incredibly hard to lose them so suddenly." Jimmy just nodded, not trusting himself to speak any more. The lump in his throat was growing, and the last thing he wanted was to break down in front of this stranger. Instead, he focused on his food, pushing his emotions aside for the moment. The man, sensing Jimmy's discomfort, didn't press the matter further. Instead, he took a deep breath and changed the subject. "You know, Jimmy, life has a way of throwing curveballs at us," the man said, his gaze intense. "But what I've learned is that even the toughest situations can teach us something important. You have to choose how you respond." Jimmy looked up, not fully understanding what the man meant. He had heard people say things like this before, especially at shelters or group homes, but it never made sense to him. How was he supposed to choose how to respond when life kept knocking him down? How was he supposed to change his life when he didn't have a single person to turn to? "I don't know what you mean," Jimmy admitted quietly, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't even know where I'll sleep tonight." The man took another sip of coffee before answering, his voice calm and measured. "Sometimes, we can't control our circumstances. But we can control what we do next. That's the one thing that's always in our hands." Jimmy didn't respond immediately. His mind raced. It sounded good, but how could that be true? He didn't have a job, he didn't have any family left, and every day was a struggle to survive. How could he possibly have control over anything? The man, sensing Jimmy's skepticism, gave him a reassuring smile. "I know it sounds hard to believe, but change starts with small steps. And sometimes, it's about getting the help you need at the right time." Jimmy stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Was this some kind of motivational speech? Or was this man actually trying to help him? He didn't know what to believe anymore. Just as he was about to say something, the man spoke again. "Look, I don't want to make promises I can't keep. But I want to offer you something, Jimmy. Something that might help you take that first step." Jimmy leaned forward, intrigued. "What is it?" "I run a foundation," the man explained, his eyes serious. "It's a project I've started to help people who've fallen on hard times, people who've lost their way. It's not just about giving handouts. It's about giving people the resources and support they need to build a future. I think you've got a lot of potential, Jimmy. And I'd like to help you." Jimmy's heart skipped a beat. Could it be true? Could this man actually be offering him a chance to change his life? The idea felt so far-fetched, but at the same time, there was something in the man's eyes that made Jimmy believe he was sincere. "I don't know if I can accept something like that," Jimmy said hesitantly. "What if I mess it up? What if I fail?" The man shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. "Jimmy, it's not about being perfect. It's about trying. And I promise you, you won't be alone in this." For the first time in a long while, Jimmy felt a spark of hope flicker inside him. He had spent so long feeling invisible, like nobody cared, and now here was this stranger, someone who didn't even know him, offering him a chance. He swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. I don't know what to say. I've never had someone offer me something like this before." "You don't need to say anything, Jimmy," the man replied, his tone warm and encouraging. "All I ask is that you think about it. Just give yourself a chance. That's all anyone can do." Jimmy sat back in his seat, his mind racing. Could this be real? Could he really start over, build something better for himself? The possibilities seemed endless, but the fear of failure still gnawed at him. It was hard to imagine a life beyond the streets, beyond the survival mode he had been living in for so long. But at that moment, with the man sitting across from him, offering him a glimmer of hope, Jimmy realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Something he never thought possible. "I'll think about it," Jimmy said finally, his voice low but full of determination. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to find out. The man smiled warmly. "That's all I can ask for. And remember, Jimmy, you're not alone." The diner was quiet now, the morning rush ebbing away as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Jimmy sat across from the man, still processing everything that had just happened. The pancakes that had once seemed like the greatest thing he'd ever tasted now felt like a distant memory. The weight of the man's words lingered in his mind, turning over and over, refusing to let him go. "You're not alone," the man had said. How could that be? How could anyone like him, a homeless kid with nothing, possibly not be alone? It didn't make sense. Jimmy had spent the better part of the last year feeling isolated, forgotten by a world that seemed to care little for people like him. The idea that someone, a complete stranger, might actually want to help him was so foreign, it almost felt like a dream. But as he looked across the table at the man, his sharp suit, his calm demeanor, the kindness in his eyes, Jimmy couldn't shake the feeling that this was real. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he didn't feel like an afterthought. He didn't feel like a shadow in the background of everyone else's life. "Thank you," Jimmy said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice felt thick with emotion, though he wasn't sure why. He was used to feeling invisible, but now, for some reason, he felt seen. The man gave him a small, understanding smile. "You don't need to thank me, Jimmy. You just need to know that it's okay to ask for help. And it's okay to take a chance." Taking a chance. Those words kept echoing in Jimmy's mind. Could he really take a chance? Could he trust this man, trust that things could change? He didn't know, but something inside him told him to try. "You said you run a foundation," Jimmy said, trying to shift the focus back to the offer. "What exactly do you do?" The man leaned back in his seat, folding his arms in a casual, yet purposeful way. "Our goal is to provide people with the tools they need to get back on their feet. It's not just about giving people money or food, though we do that too. We help people find jobs, get access to education, secure housing, and build relationships. It's about empowerment, not charity." Jimmy nodded, though he wasn't sure what any of it meant. Jobs, education, housing, those were things he had never thought about in any serious way. All he had ever focused on was surviving from day to day, finding enough food to fill his stomach, and finding a safe place to sleep at night. The idea of a stable future felt so far out of reach. "Sounds hard," Jimmy said honestly, his eyes downcast as he stirred his coffee. "I don't know if I can do all that." The man's eyes softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but firm. "Jimmy, nobody expects you to do it all at once. The important thing is to start. Just one small step. And you won't be doing it alone. We'll help you every step of the way. I'll help you." There was something in the man's words that made Jimmy believe him. He had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe that this wasn't some kind of trick or empty promise. But something about this man, about the way he spoke, the way he genuinely seemed to care, made Jimmy think that maybe, just maybe, this was a chance worth taking. "I've never had anyone help me like this," Jimmy said, the words coming out softer now, more vulnerable than he'd meant them to be. "I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to know right now," the man replied. "But I want to help you, Jimmy. I'm here because I see something in you. You have potential. And I'm not going to let you slip through the cracks." The sincerity in the man's voice cut through the fog of doubt clouding Jimmy's mind. The fear was still there, lurking in the background, but for the first time, it wasn't the only thing he felt. There was something else now. A flicker of hope. A small, fragile spark, but a spark nonetheless. The man reached into his briefcase, pulling out a business card. He slid it across the table toward Jimmy. "This is my number," the man said. "Call me whenever you're ready. We'll take it slow, but I'll be here." And I'll help you get started on whatever you want to do next. Jimmy stared at the card, his fingers brushing over the smooth surface of it. A name was printed on it, Elon Musk. Underneath, the words, Founder, Foundation for Change, were written in bold lettering. Jimmy felt a lump form in his throat. Elon Musk? The name was familiar, he'd seen it in the news, in magazines. The billionaire entrepreneur. The man who had built rockets and electric cars, who had changed the world in so many ways. He never expected someone like that to be sitting across from him in a diner, offering him a chance. I don't know what to say, Jimmy mumbled, his heart racing. You're serious about this, aren't you? Elon smiled, a glimmer of warmth in his eyes. I wouldn't offer it if I wasn't. I see a lot of people who give up because they think they have no options. I don't want you to be one of those people. Everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone deserves hope. Jimmy's mind swirled with the possibilities. Could this really be his second chance? Could he actually build a life, start over, find stability? The weight of it all was overwhelming, but it wasn't just fear he felt. There was excitement too. The idea of something different, something better, seemed so far away, but now, it felt like it might actually be within his reach. You're not alone, Jimmy, Elon repeated, his voice soft but insistent. There's always a way forward. And you've got what it takes to find it. For the first time in a long while, Jimmy allowed himself to believe it. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The following days after the meeting with Elon were a whirlwind for Jimmy. He found himself replaying their conversation over and over in his mind, the words echoing in his head like a constant reminder of the promise that had been extended to him. You're not alone, Elon had said, and for the first time, it felt like those words might be true. But still, Jimmy hesitated. He had never been good at asking for help. He had learned the hard way that people could disappoint you, that promises made in the heat of the moment often disappeared when things got tough. And now, here he was, sitting at the edge of a huge, intimidating opportunity. A chance to change his life. It felt almost unreal. The business card Elon had given him sat on the small, threadbare table in the corner of his room at the shelter. Each time he looked at it, a part of him wanted to pick up the phone and call. To take that first step. But another part of him held back, afraid of what would happen if it all fell apart. What if he wasn't good enough? What if this was just a cruel joke? Get it together, Jimmy, he muttered to himself one evening as he sat alone in the corner of the shelter. He could hear the noise of others in the background, the familiar sounds of people talking, laughing, or fighting. His life had always been surrounded by this chaos. But in this moment, everything felt still. The weight of his decision hung in the air, pressing down on him. As if by instinct, Jimmy pulled out his phone and stared at the business card again. The number was there, plain as day, ready for him to dial. His fingers hovered over the screen, trembling just slightly. The fear was real. The fear of failing was real. But then he remembered something Elon had said, it's not about being perfect. It's about trying. With a deep breath, Jimmy pressed the dial button. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. Hello. It was Elon's voice, calm and clear, just as it had been in the diner. Jimmy swallowed hard. He could feel his pulse racing. Hi. It's Jimmy. I'm calling because I think I'm ready to take that step. For a moment, there was silence on the other end, as if Elon was letting the words sink in. Then, a soft chuckle. I'm glad to hear that, Jimmy, Elon said, his voice warm but steady. We can take this one step at a time. I'll help you get started. Are you ready for the first challenge? Jimmy could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had expected hesitation, maybe even rejection, but instead, Elon sounded like he was genuinely excited. It made Jimmy feel like this could be real. Like someone out there cared. What kind of challenge? Jimmy asked, his voice quieter now, still uncertain but willing to take the plunge. There's a program we offer that helps people like you get back on their feet, Elon explained. It's a combination of job readiness training, mentorship, and resources to help you find a place to stay. The first step is about learning how to rebuild your foundation. And I want to help you get started with that. Jimmy's heart skipped a beat. It sounded too good to be true, but there was a hope inside him that refused to be quieted. Okay. I'm willing to try, he said, finally allowing himself to believe that this could be the turning point. Elon gave him the details. He'd set up a meeting for the following Monday at one of the foundation's centers, a place where people who were ready to make a change could come and find the support they needed. Jimmy's head was spinning, but a new feeling was rising in him. This was his chance. Great, Elon said, his voice reassuring. I'll meet you there. Just bring yourself, and an open mind. We'll take care of the rest. The weekend before the meeting felt like a blur. Jimmy spent it in a mix of excitement and dread. He couldn't sleep well, constantly turning over in his mind what his life might look like if he followed through. What if he couldn't keep up with the others in the program? What if they found out he didn't belong there? What if he failed? But another part of him kept pushing through the fear. The small voice of hope told him that this was his chance. Maybe he wasn't meant to live this life forever. Maybe he didn't have to be alone anymore. On Sunday evening, he laid out the clothes he had, old, faded jeans, a t-shirt that had seen better days, and sneakers that had carried him across countless streets, but it was the best he could do. He didn't have a suit. He didn't have anything that made him look like someone who had a chance. But he was going to try anyway. The next morning, he took a deep breath as he stood outside the shelter, the cool air rushing past him. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew he had to go. He had to do this. As he walked to the center, the streets that once seemed so familiar now felt a little different. They felt like they might lead him somewhere new. He noticed little things he'd never noticed before, the way the light hit the glass of the office buildings, the way the city hummed with life all around him. The world was big, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might have a place in it. When he arrived at the Foundation's building, it looked nothing like the cold, impersonal shelters he had stayed in before. This place was clean, warm, and inviting. People were talking and laughing as they walked in and out, all with a sense of purpose, a sense of hope. Jimmy walked up to the door and pushed it open. Inside, the scent of coffee and fresh pastries greeted him. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. "You must be Jimmy. We're expecting you." Before he could say anything, she stood and motioned for him to follow her. The whole building felt different. There was a sense of energy in the air, an energy he hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't just a place where people lived, this was a place where people were changing their lives. He was here. This was real. As they walked through the halls, Jimmy felt a spark of excitement, and just a little bit of fear. But he knew he was here for a reason. He was ready to take the first step. The door to the conference room swung open, and Jimmy stepped inside, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, maybe a cold, sterile environment or people who looked at him with pity. But instead, he was greeted with a warm, welcoming space. Soft lighting bathed the room, and the walls were adorned with motivational posters. A small group of people sat around a table, their faces a mix of age and experience, some with a clear sense of purpose and others still looking uncertain, like Jimmy. Elon Musk was standing at the front of the room, speaking with a small group of volunteers. When he turned and saw Jimmy, he gave him a friendly smile, his eyes lighting up with recognition. The warmth of his gaze calmed Jimmy's nerves just a little. "Ah, Jimmy. I'm glad you made it." Elon walked toward him and extended his hand. "Come on in. I know it's a lot, but we're going to take this step by step." Jimmy shook his hand, still feeling a bit out of place. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. He had expected the other people in the room to stare at him, to judge him for not fitting in. But no one did. In fact, a few of them gave him encouraging smiles, nodding as though they understood exactly what he was going through. Elon led him to an empty chair, and after a few moments of small talk, everyone took their seats around the table. There were 6 people in total, each of them sitting with a quiet determination in their eyes. Jimmy felt like he was intruding on something important, but also like he was meant to be there. "All right," Elon began, his voice carrying across the room, "let's get started. I know this might feel overwhelming, but remember, everyone here has taken the first step, and that's the hardest part. Today, we're going to talk about what you need in order to get back on your feet, whether that's a job, a place to stay, or just support from others. This isn't about judging anyone's past. This is about creating a future." Jimmy listened intently as Elon outlined the Foundations program. The process would involve workshops, job readiness training, and mentorship, with the ultimate goal of helping everyone in the room find steady work and long-term housing. There would also be life skills courses, everything from budgeting to emotional resilience. The foundation wasn't just about giving people handouts, it was about helping them build the tools they needed to succeed. The other participants took turns sharing their stories. Each person's journey was unique, but they all had one thing in common: they had struggled, and they were here now, trying to rebuild. A woman in her early 30s spoke first. Her name was Emily, and she had been homeless off and on for years after a series of bad decisions and abusive relationships. She had 2 young children, and her greatest hope was to get a stable job and secure housing so she could give them a better future. "I'm not perfect," Emily said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I want to make things right. I want to be a good mom. And I know I can't do it alone." Another man, Jake, a middle-aged man with a gruff exterior, shared his story next. "I've been in and out of shelters for the last 10 years, he said. "I've struggled with addiction. But I've been sober for a year now, and I want a chance to turn my life around. I know it won't be easy, but I'm ready." Jimmy sat quietly, listening to each person's story. He couldn't believe how open they were being, how much they were sharing. It made him feel less alone, like they were all in this together. Then, it was his turn. All eyes turned to him, and he felt the weight of their gazes, but for some reason, it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like understanding. Jimmy took a deep breath. I'm Jimmy. I don't really have a lot to say. I've been homeless for about a year now. I lost my mom a few years ago, and since then, I've just been drifting. I don't really know what I want to do, but I know I can't keep living the way I've been living. I don't want to be invisible anymore." There was silence for a moment, and then Elon spoke. "Thank you, Jimmy. That took courage," he said, his voice filled with encouragement. "It's not easy to share your story, but you've taken the first step. That's something to be proud of." The group nodded, offering Jimmy small smiles of solidarity. It was an unexpected comfort. They weren't just participants in a program, they were a community, one that supported each other, no matter where they were from or what they had been through. Elon continued, "What we're doing here isn't just about getting a job or a house. It's about giving you the skills and the confidence to know that you have the power to change your life. We're going to teach you how to rebuild, but it's up to you to take the tools and use them." Jimmy's heart started to pound in his chest. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about thriving. He had been given a chance. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like there might be a future worth fighting for. After the meeting, Jimmy stayed behind for a brief one-on-one with Elon. They sat in a quiet corner of the room, and Jimmy could feel his nerves start to creep back in. He had so many questions, so many fears, but something about Elon's calm presence helped ease them. "So, Jimmy," Elon began, looking at him with an encouraging smile, "I know this is a lot to take in. But I want you to remember one thing: you're not here to prove anything to anyone. You're here because you're ready to change your life. And that's all that matters. Jimmy nodded, though a part of him still felt unsure. But he wasn't about to back down now. He had made it this far. What do I do next? Jimmy asked, his voice quiet but resolute. Elon smiled again. We'll start with some basic training. We'll work on building your resume, developing job skills, and getting you set up with housing. But most importantly, we'll work on strengthening your confidence, because you're more capable than you know. Jimmy felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest. This was real. This was happening. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. I don't know if I can do it, but I'm going to try. I know you will, Elon replied, his tone firm and reassuring. And I'll be here every step of the way. As Jimmy left the building that day, he felt something shift within him. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He was walking out of the foundation with a sense of purpose, with a glimmer of hope that had long been absent from his life. For the first time in a long time, Jimmy felt like he was on the right path. Jimmy's first few days in the program were a blur of new faces, new tasks, and new routines. He had never been much of a planner, and the idea of setting goals and working toward them seemed like an overwhelming challenge. But the support he received from the foundation, the mentors, and even the other participants made it all feel possible. For the first time in ages, Jimmy was waking up each morning with a sense of purpose, a sense of moving forward. One of the first things he did was meet with his assigned mentor, a woman named Laura. She was in her late 40s, with a kind face that radiated calm energy. She had been through her own struggles in life, and she knew exactly what it was like to feel like there was no way out. But Laura had come out the other side, and now, she was dedicated to helping people like Jimmy find their way. The first task Laura gave him was to write down his goals. It seemed like such a simple thing, but it felt foreign to Jimmy. He had never really thought about his future in any concrete way. All he had ever done was try to survive from one day to the next. I don't even know where to start, Jimmy admitted, sitting across from Laura in the small office they had set up for meetings. That's okay, Laura said gently. We'll start small. It doesn't have to be a long list. Just think about one or two things you want to change in your life. Jimmy sat back in his chair, staring at the paper in front of him. For a long time, he had dreamed of a better life, of having a job that he could be proud of, a place to call his own, and a sense of stability. But how could he achieve any of that when he didn't even know where to begin? Finally, he wrote down two simple goals: find a steady job and get my own place to live. I think that's a good place to start, Laura said, smiling. These are big goals, but they're achievable. And we're going to work together to make them happen. That evening, Jimmy couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the goals he had written down. They felt like mountains, towering above him, far too high to climb. But something inside him refused to let go of the idea of a better life. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a reason to keep going. He wasn't just wandering aimlessly anymore. He was moving toward something. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of training, interviews, and tough conversations. Jimmy spent his days working on his resume, practicing for interviews, and attending job readiness workshops. He learned how to handle rejection, how to handle criticism, and, most importantly, how to push through even when things got tough. There were days when he wanted to give up, when the weight of his past felt too heavy to carry. But each time he stumbled, there was someone there to help him get back on his feet: Laura, Elon, or even the other participants in the program. They were all on this journey together, and that sense of community made the process a little easier to bear. Jimmy had always thought of himself as a failure. He had always seen himself as someone who was doomed to live on the fringes of society, someone who would never be able to rise above the life he had been dealt. But the more he learned, the more he realized that he wasn't a failure. He was just someone who had been through hard times, like so many others. And those hard times didn't define him. He was starting to see that he could create a new story for himself. One day, as Jimmy was going through a mock interview with Laura, he was struck by something. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't faking it. He wasn't pretending to be someone he wasn't. He was speaking the truth, about his struggles, about his desire to change, and about his willingness to work hard to achieve his goals. "I'm ready to work," Jimmy said, his voice steady. "I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get back on my feet." Laura smiled, clearly impressed. "That's the kind of attitude that will take you far, Jimmy. I know you can do this." The following week, Jimmy had his first real interview. It was for a job at a local warehouse, one that would provide a steady paycheck and give him the stability he so desperately needed. He had spent hours preparing for this moment, practicing his answers, rehearsing his body language, and trying to push away the nerves. When he walked into the interview room, his hands were still shaking, but his mind was focused. He was determined to make a good impression. The interviewer, a middle-aged man named Mr. Harris, seemed like a no-nonsense kind of guy, but there was something in his eyes that told Jimmy he could make it. "So, Jimmy," Mr. Harris began, "tell me why you're interested in this position." Jimmy took a deep breath, remembering everything he had learned in his workshops. He looked Mr. Harris in the eye, his voice clear and confident. "I've been through a lot in my life," he started, "but I've learned that it's never too late to change. I'm looking for a job where I can work hard, learn new skills, and contribute to something important. I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty, and I'm willing to put in the effort to do whatever it takes to succeed." Mr. Harris nodded thoughtfully. "I like what I'm hearing. Tell me about a time when you had to overcome a challenge." Jimmy paused for a moment, remembering a time when he had been on the streets and had to figure out how to survive on his own. It wasn't a glamorous story, but it was his story. And it was one he was proud of. "I've had to face a lot of challenges in my life," Jimmy said, his voice steady. "But I've learned that no matter how hard things get, you have to keep going. I've made it this far because I've kept pushing forward, even when it seemed impossible." The interview went on for another 20 minutes, but Jimmy could feel the tension start to melt away. He wasn't just getting through it, he was connecting with the interviewer, showing him who he was, not what he had been. By the end of the interview, Mr. Harris stood up and extended his hand. "I'll be in touch soon," he said. "But I'll be honest with you, Jimmy. You're exactly the kind of person we're looking for." As Jimmy walked out of the building, he couldn't believe it. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally moving in the right direction. He wasn't just hoping for a better future, he was building it, step by step. The following week, Jimmy received a call that made his heart race. It was Mr. Harris from the warehouse. "Hello, Jimmy, this is Mr. Harris. I wanted to let you know that we've decided to offer you the position. We were impressed with your interview, and we believe you'll be a great fit for the team." Jimmy's breath caught in his chest. His hands were shaking, but he could hardly believe the words he was hearing. Thank you so much. I won't let you down." Mr. Harris chuckled. "We're looking forward to having you on board. We'll send over the details in an email, but we'll start you on Monday at 8 a.m. The moment the call ended, Jimmy felt like he could finally exhale. He had a job. Not just any job, but a chance to prove to himself and to everyone who had ever doubted him that he could do it. He had taken the first major step in transforming his life, and the road ahead was still long, but this was something real. That weekend, Jimmy was filled with nervous excitement. His room at the shelter didn't feel as cold anymore. He took a long, hard look at the small space that had been his home for the last several months. It wasn't much, but it was a place to start. He had made it this far. The thought of having his own apartment one day didn't feel so far off anymore. When Sunday evening came, Jimmy prepared for his first day at the warehouse. He laid out his clothes, his best pair of jeans, a clean shirt, and the only pair of shoes he owned that didn't have holes. He had learned through his job readiness training that first impressions were critical, and he wanted to look as presentable as he could. Before heading to bed, he texted Laura to thank her for everything. She had been with him every step of the way, guiding him, reassuring him, and giving him the strength to believe in himself. The text read, "I don't know if I would have made it this far without you. Thanks for always being there. I'm ready for tomorrow." Her reply came almost instantly. "You've done all the hard work, Jimmy. Now it's time to show the world what you're made of. You've got this." Monday morning came, and Jimmy was up before the alarm. His nerves were still there, but there was a new feeling this time, confidence. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was actively taking control of his future. When he arrived at the warehouse, he was greeted by Mr. Harris and the rest of the team. The work was physically demanding, but it didn't scare Jimmy. He had learned to adapt in so many ways over the past year, and now it was time to apply that resilience. The first few hours were a blur of activity, lifting boxes, organizing supplies, and learning the ropes. The work wasn't easy, but it felt good. For the first time in a long time, Jimmy felt like he was contributing to something. He was making a difference, even if it was just in the smallest way. Around lunchtime, Mr. Harris pulled him aside. "You're doing great, Jimmy," he said, his voice full of approval. "You're a quick learner, and your attitude is exactly what we need here. Keep it up." Jimmy's heart swelled with pride. He had always been told he was a disappointment, a lost cause. But today, he was being told the opposite. He was being told that he had potential. Over the next few weeks, Jimmy settled into the routine at the warehouse. The work was tough, but it wasn't the physical strain that challenged him, it was the emotional weight of finally realizing that he was starting to build the life he had always dreamed of. He was earning a paycheck, something he hadn't done in years. He was making progress toward his goal of having a place of his own. And most importantly, he was proving to himself that he could do this. There were difficult days, of course. Days when he was exhausted or frustrated, when the reality of the work set in and made him wonder if he was cut out for it. But each time that doubt crept in, he reminded himself of why he was here, for the future, for the life he wanted, for the people who believed in him, including Elon and Laura. One of those tough days came when the warehouse had to undergo an inspection. Jimmy had been tasked with organizing and cleaning a section of the inventory room, and he was determined to make it perfect. But as the deadline approached, everything seemed to fall apart. He had knocked over a few boxes, and now the clock was ticking. He could feel the pressure mounting as the other workers worked around him. Just as he was about to give up, he remembered something Laura had told him during one of their mentoring sessions. When things feel like they're falling apart, take a step back. Breathe. You have the ability to handle this, just like you've handled everything else. One step at a time. Taking a deep breath, Jimmy forced himself to slow down. He focused on one box at a time, one section at a time, until the room was exactly how it needed to be. The inspector arrived, and after a few tense moments, he gave Jimmy a nod of approval. "Good work, Jimmy," he said with a smile. "You really turned things around in here." Jimmy smiled back, the exhaustion of the day slipping away. This was it. This was the kind of work he wanted to be doing. It wasn't just about the paycheck, it was about the pride in knowing he could take on challenges and come out on top. The days turned into weeks, and Jimmy continued to work hard. His paycheck allowed him to start saving for a deposit on an apartment. The idea of having his own place no longer felt like a distant dream, it felt like a real possibility. He could already picture himself in a small apartment, sitting at a table with a hot meal, looking out the window, knowing he had earned everything. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be obstacles ahead, but Jimmy was ready. He was no longer the boy who wandered the streets, hoping for a miracle. He was the man who was making his own luck, one small step at a time. The weeks passed in a blur of hard work, learning, and small victories. Jimmy had grown used to the routine at the warehouse, but something inside him had begun to stir. It wasn't just the physical demands of the job that had started to weigh on him, it was the knowledge that, despite all the progress he had made, he was still living in the shelter. His small room at the facility had become a safe space, but it wasn't the life he truly wanted. He had a job now, and he was earning money, but he was still just a step away from independence. The idea of finding his own place had always seemed like a far-off dream, something that other people did, not someone like him. But now, as the days turned into months, he found himself thinking about it more and more. One afternoon, after a long day at work, Jimmy walked out of the warehouse and headed toward the shelter. It was a quiet evening, and the sun was setting in the distance, casting a golden glow across the city. Jimmy had become accustomed to the sight of this city, full of both opportunities and challenges. As he passed by a small cafe, he saw a poster on the window, "Affordable housing available, apply now." His heart skipped a beat. Affordable housing? He had heard about such programs before, but he had never really believed he could qualify. Still, something about the sign made him stop and read the details. It was a long shot, but he had nothing to lose. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the poster. That night, in his room at the shelter, Jimmy sat down at the small desk with his phone. He clicked through the housing application, filled out the forms with trembling hands, and submitted the application. The process didn't take long, but it felt like a monumental step for him, like he was finally reaching out for something real, something that wasn't just about survival. The next morning, as he sipped his coffee, Jimmy received an email notification. His heart raced as he opened the message. "We have received your application for affordable housing. You have been placed on the waiting list. Thank you for your interest." It wasn't a promise, but it was the first tangible step toward independence. For the first time in years, Jimmy felt a glimmer of hope that things might actually get better. He wasn't just dreaming anymore, he was making it happen. The following weeks continued to be a mix of challenges and triumphs. Jimmy kept up with his work at the warehouse, slowly earning the respect of his coworkers. He found himself more confident each day. He had learned to interact with the team, ask for help when needed, and even offer help to others who were struggling. One day, as he was working with another new employee, a young man named Carlos, Jimmy found himself reflecting on just how far he had come. Carlos was having a hard time adjusting to the physical nature of the job, and he kept complaining about how tired he was. "Man, I get it," Jimmy said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "When I first started, I thought I'd never make it. But you just gotta push through. It's hard, but it gets easier the longer you stick with it." Carlos looked at him, surprised. "You've been doing this for a while, huh?" Jimmy smiled. "Yeah, a few months now. You'll get there. Just don't give up." For the first time in a long time, Jimmy realized that he was no longer the one who needed saving. He was the one offering encouragement, the one showing someone else how to keep going. The days turned into weeks, and then, finally, the email came. "Congratulations. You have been selected for an available apartment. Please visit our office to complete the next steps in the process." Jimmy read the email 3 times, unsure if he was seeing it correctly. He felt like he was floating, his heart racing with disbelief and excitement. It was happening. He was getting his own apartment. The next morning, he went to the housing office to finalize the paperwork. As he sat across from the agent, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride and disbelief. It seemed like just yesterday he had been on the streets, struggling to survive. And now, here he was, signing the lease for his very first apartment. "I can't believe this is real," Jimmy said to the agent, his voice thick with emotion. The agent smiled warmly. "It's real, Jimmy. You've worked hard for this, and now you're going to have a place to call your own." That evening, as Jimmy stood in his new apartment, he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The place was small, but it was his. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, but it didn't matter. He had a bed, a kitchen, and a place to hang his coat. It was all he needed. He opened the window and looked out over the city. The lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, Jimmy felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. He spent the next few days settling in, putting together basic furniture, and making the apartment feel like home. He found a small kitchen table at a thrift store, along with a couple of chairs. He bought a few plates, utensils, and basic cooking supplies. It wasn't much, but it was everything to him. When the apartment was ready, he texted Laura. "I did it. I've got my own place." Her reply came quickly, "I knew you could do it, Jimmy. This is just the beginning." Life in his new apartment was a transition. Jimmy had to learn how to manage bills, grocery shopping, and all the small details that came with living independently. It wasn't easy. Some days, he found himself feeling overwhelmed by the responsibilities. But he kept reminding himself that this was what he had worked for. Every night before bed, Jimmy would sit at his small kitchen table, eating the simple meals he had prepared for himself. He would look around at his little apartment, and a feeling of pride would swell inside him. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And for the first time in his life, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Life in his new apartment felt like a dream, and yet, every moment was a reminder of the hard work it had taken to get there. Jimmy had spent so many nights lying awake in his cramped room at the shelter, wondering if he would ever be able to break free from the cycle of poverty and uncertainty. Now, as he sat at his small kitchen table in his very own place, he had a new sense of determination. But with this newfound independence came a set of challenges he hadn't fully anticipated. The apartment, while modest, required more than just emotional strength to maintain. It required money, time, and energy. And while Jimmy had a steady paycheck from the warehouse, the reality of budgeting for rent, utilities, food, and all the other small expenses was overwhelming. His paychecks, while enough to cover the basics, didn't leave much room for anything else. One night, after a long day at work, Jimmy sat at his kitchen table, the only light coming from the overhead bulb and the faint glow of his phone screen. He opened his banking app to check his balance. Rent was due in 2 days, and after accounting for his expenses, there wasn't much left to spare. He could cover rent, barely, but there wouldn't be any money left for things like groceries, toiletries, or any unexpected expenses. He ran his fingers through his hair, feeling a knot of stress tighten in his chest. This was the part of independence that he hadn't quite prepared for, the constant balancing act between survival and stability. He'd come so far, and yet, it still felt like he was barely hanging on. The next morning, Jimmy arrived at the warehouse, tired and worn out from the weight of his worries. He tried to push those thoughts aside as he threw himself into his work, but the stress gnawed at him. The physical labor was hard, but it was the mental load of managing his life outside of work that was beginning to take a toll. During lunch, he sat with Carlos, who had become more than just a coworker. They had developed a friendship over the last few weeks, and Jimmy found himself opening up to him about his struggles. "Man, I'm starting to wonder if I'm doing the right thing," Jimmy confessed, shoveling a spoonful of soup into his mouth. "I've got this apartment now, but I can barely make ends meet. Rent's coming up, and I don't have enough for food, let alone anything else." Carlos looked up from his lunch, his expression thoughtful. "I get it, man. It's tough. But remember, you're doing better than you were. You're taking control. That's more than most people can say." Jimmy nodded, but it didn't feel like enough. The weight of his financial situation hung heavily on him. It wasn't just about the money, it was about proving to himself that he could do this, that he could manage his life and thrive. He didn't want to slip back into the uncertainty of his past. He couldn't. Later that week, Jimmy decided to take a bold step. He reached out to Laura for advice. She had been his mentor for months now, always encouraging him, offering guidance when he needed it. If anyone could help him navigate these rough waters, it was her. He texted her, "Hey, can we talk? I could use some advice on budgeting and how to make things work. I'm doing okay, but I feel like I'm just treading water." Within minutes, Laura replied, "Of course. I'll give you a call tonight. Don't worry, you're not alone in this." That evening, Jimmy sat down with his phone, feeling a little less anxious knowing that Laura would help him figure things out. When the call came through, he answered quickly, eager to hear her voice. "Hey, Jimmy, how's it going?" she asked, her voice warm and reassuring. "I'm managing," Jimmy replied, his voice a little rough. "But I've hit a wall. I'm doing everything I can, but the money's tight, and I'm not sure how to make it work long term." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Laura spoke again. "I get it, Jimmy. Life is a balancing act, especially when you're trying to build from scratch. But let's break it down together. Have you started making a budget yet?" Jimmy felt a pang of guilt. "I've tried, but it's hard to keep track of everything. There's always something new, things I didn't expect." "That's totally normal," Laura said. "It's hard when everything is new, and you're figuring it out as you go. But you're learning. First things first, let's talk about your priorities. What's the most important thing you need to focus on right now?" Jimmy thought for a moment. "Rent is the biggest thing right now. I have to make sure I can pay that. Then it's food, and then I guess just basic things like toiletries and bills." "Great, that's a good start," Laura said. "Now, let's think about ways to trim down your expenses. Are you able to cook your own meals, or are you buying takeout?" "I'm cooking as much as I can," Jimmy replied. "But I don't have a lot of options. I try to buy what I can afford, but sometimes it feels like I'm barely making ends meet." "Okay, so food might be an area where you can cut back a bit. Have you looked for local food banks or community resources that might offer support?" Jimmy's eyes widened. He had never considered that before. "No, I haven't. Do you think that would help?" Laura's voice was filled with understanding. "Absolutely. Many places offer free or low-cost food to people in need. It's not charity, it's just a resource to help you get by while you're building up your stability." Jimmy felt a wave of relief wash over him. He hadn't known where to turn for help, but now he had a place to start. Over the next few days, Jimmy began to implement the advice Laura had given him. He researched local food banks, made a list of his expenses, and started tracking his spending more carefully. Slowly but surely, things started to come together. He found a food pantry near his apartment and began receiving groceries once a week, which eased some of the financial pressure. He also started to cook larger meals that would last for several days, stretching his budget further. Still, despite these small victories, Jimmy knew that the road ahead was long. He wasn't out of the woods yet. But for the first time since moving into his apartment, he felt a little less overwhelmed. He had a plan, and he was taking the steps needed to make things work. As he sat down to eat a simple dinner in his new apartment, he thought about how far he had come. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was building something. And with the support of people like Laura, Carlos, and even his own determination, Jimmy was beginning to realize that no matter how hard things got, he wasn't going to give up. The weeks following Jimmy's conversation with Laura were filled with both challenges and quiet victories. His life had become a series of small adjustments, each one a step closer to the stability he so desperately sought. He had learned how to stretch his paycheck, found local resources to help with food, and even started a savings plan. Though it was modest, it was something. The warehouse job remained physically demanding, but Jimmy had grown stronger, not just in his body, but in his spirit. He found himself waking up each day with a renewed sense of purpose. Though his mornings began with the same routine, there was a difference in the way he approached life now. Each action, no matter how small, felt like a part of his grand journey toward a better future. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling shift, Jimmy sat on the steps outside the warehouse, wiping sweat from his brow. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from Laura. "Hey, I heard about an opportunity that might be a great fit for you. There's a community college offering a night class in warehouse management. It's part-time, and I think it could give you a leg up in your career." Jimmy felt a surge of excitement mixed with skepticism. A part-time class? It felt like a huge leap, especially when every penny was already accounted for, and there was no room for error in his budget. But he also knew that if he kept doing the same thing, he would always be stuck in the same cycle. He responded quickly, "That sounds amazing. But how would I even manage the time and money for that?" Laura replied almost instantly, "I know it's a big ask, but if you want to grow and move forward, this might be your chance. Plus, I can help you find scholarships or financial aid. You've already made it this far, why not push for more?" The words hit Jimmy like a wave. Why not push for more? That simple question echoed in his mind. He had already come so far, why shouldn't he take a chance on himself? The next few days were filled with research and preparation. Jimmy went online and found the details for the class. It was an investment, both in terms of time and money, but the potential benefits were undeniable. The class would provide him with the skills and certifications necessary to step into higher-paying roles, ones that could give him the financial freedom he so badly wanted. But the cost of the class was significant. He had saved a small amount, but not nearly enough to cover the tuition. He had a sinking feeling in his stomach. This was the part where he often hesitated, where his fear of failure stopped him from taking the leap. And yet, this time, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. That evening, after work, he found himself walking to a nearby coffee shop to clear his head. He sat by the window, watching the world go by, lost in thought. A few months ago, he wouldn't have even considered such a big step. But now, after everything he had been through, he felt like he had something to prove, not to anyone else, but to himself. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from the community college. Reminder: financial aid applications are due in 1 week. Jimmy stared at the message, the weight of it sinking in. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The next day, he took a deep breath and filled out the financial aid application. It was a nerve-wracking process, one that made him second-guess himself at every step. But when he hit the submit button, a feeling of relief washed over him. He had done everything he could. A week later, just as he was beginning to doubt that it would work out, Jimmy received an email. "Congratulations, your financial aid application has been approved. You are now enrolled in the warehouse management class for the upcoming semester." The first day of class arrived, and Jimmy was filled with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He had never been the type of person to sit in a classroom. School had always felt like something for other people, people who didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from. But now, here he was, walking into the community college building, ready to face his fears and embrace the opportunity. The class was small, and Jimmy immediately noticed that the students were a diverse mix of people, all with different backgrounds but united by their desire for a better future. Some were older than him, others were younger, but they all shared a common goal. He felt a sense of camaraderie with them, a shared understanding that this was not just another class, it was a stepping stone to something greater. As the instructor began the lesson, Jimmy listened attentively, absorbing every word. The class was more challenging than he had anticipated, but it was also exhilarating. He felt like he was finally learning something that would make a real difference in his life. Over the next few months, Jimmy balanced work, school, and life in his small apartment. It wasn't easy, but he found a rhythm. His days were long, and the evenings spent studying were exhausting, but there was a sense of fulfillment that came with the hard work. He was no longer just surviving, he was actively building a future. He still faced struggles, of course. There were days when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear. Sometimes, he would lie awake at night, wondering if he was doing the right thing. But when he looked at the progress he had made, how far he had come since those first dark days in the shelter, he knew he was on the right path. One evening, after a particularly long class, Jimmy returned to his apartment to find a message waiting for him on his phone. It was from Laura. "Hey, I just wanted to check in and say how proud I am of you. I know it's not easy, but I can see how much you've grown. Keep pushing, you're going to make it." Jimmy smiled as he read her message. He wasn't doing this alone. He had people who believed in him, people who saw the strength in him even when he couldn't see it himself. That night, as he sat at his desk studying, Jimmy realized that the strength he needed to succeed wasn't just about what he could do on his own. It was about the people who helped him, supported him, and reminded him that he was capable of more than he ever thought possible. For the first time in a long time, Jimmy felt like he was no longer fighting an uphill battle alone. He was part of something bigger, a community of people who had faced their own struggles and come out stronger for it. And with every step forward, Jimmy knew that he, too, was growing stronger. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? It had been several months since Jimmy began his journey toward a better life. His routine was predictable, but it wasn't mundane. Every day brought its own set of challenges, but Jimmy had learned how to embrace them. He had found a way to balance his full-time job with night classes, and although the workload was heavy, the sense of progress kept him going. As his knowledge in warehouse management grew, so did his confidence. He could now apply for roles with higher pay and greater responsibility, something he hadn't thought was possible when he first moved into his apartment. Yet, despite the progress, there was still a nagging feeling in the back of his mind, the uncertainty of whether he would ever truly escape the financial struggles that had defined so much of his life. One evening, after finishing an exhausting shift at the warehouse, Jimmy sat down in his small, dimly lit living room. He had a moment of quiet before his next task, studying for his class. But his mind wasn't focused on the textbook in front of him. He thought back to the first day he stepped into that shelter, to the overwhelming feeling of hopelessness, to the moment when he met Laura, and how everything had changed. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. He picked it up and saw a message from Carlos. "Yo, Jimmy. There's an opening at the warehouse for a supervisor position. You should apply, man. I've seen you working your ass off. They're looking for someone with leadership potential." Jimmy blinked in surprise. A supervisor position? It seemed like such a huge step, a jump from where he was. Sure, he had been learning a lot in his classes, but was he ready for that responsibility? The idea of overseeing a team of workers, managing operations, and taking on the kind of pressure he had never experienced, it made his stomach turn. But then he thought back to all the steps he had taken so far, all the growth he had experienced. Maybe this was his next challenge. Maybe this was the moment he had been working toward, the chance to prove to himself and to everyone else that he was capable of more. After a few moments of hesitation, he typed back, "Thanks, Carlos. I'll think about it." It was late by the time Jimmy finally turned off his phone and picked up his textbook. But his mind was racing. Could he really apply for the supervisor position? Was he ready to take that leap? He found it hard to focus on the material in front of him. What if he failed? What if this opportunity slipped through his fingers just like so many others? He closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. The room felt quieter than usual. He thought about his journey, about how he had turned his life around from rock bottom. The only way forward was to keep pushing, to keep going, to take the opportunities that came his way, no matter how daunting they seemed. He had come too far to turn back now. The next morning, Jimmy arrived early at the warehouse, determined to make a decision. He found Carlos near the break room, and after a quick exchange of pleasantries, Jimmy came to the point. "Carlos," he said, his voice a little hesitant, "I'm thinking about applying for that supervisor role. What do you think?" Carlos gave him a knowing smile. Man, you've got the skills. I've seen you take charge during shifts, handle problems, and keep things running smoothly. You're ready for this." Jimmy took a deep breath, still unsure, but feeling a little reassured. "You really think so?" Carlos clapped him on the shoulder. "Absolutely. You've got this. You've worked hard for it. Don't sell yourself short." The conversation gave Jimmy the confidence he needed. That afternoon, during a break, he sat down at his phone and filled out the application for the supervisor position. He hesitated only for a moment before hitting submit. He couldn't let fear hold him back anymore. If he wanted more, he had to be willing to take risks. The following days were a blur of work and school. Jimmy's focus remained on the supervisor position, but as the days passed, he tried to push the anxiety out of his mind. Then, one evening, just as he was settling down to study, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he answered. "Hello." "Hi, is this Jimmy?" a voice on the other end asked. "This is Jimmy." "Who's this?" "This is Rachel from the warehouse HR department. We've reviewed your application, and we'd like to invite you in for an interview for the supervisor position." Jimmy's breath caught in his throat. "Wait, really?" "Absolutely. We're impressed with your experience and your growth here. When can you come in for an interview?" The interview was scheduled for the following week, and as the day approached, Jimmy felt a growing sense of nervous excitement. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew one thing for sure: this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. It was a chance to take his career to the next level and break free from the limitations of his past. On the day of the interview, Jimmy woke up early, prepared himself as best as he could, and dressed in his best clothes. He may not have had much, but he could certainly make the most of what he had. He walked into the warehouse office with a sense of determination, knowing that this was his moment. Rachel, the HR manager, greeted him warmly. They talked about his experience at the warehouse, his growth in the job, and the skills he had developed over the past few months. Jimmy spoke honestly, sharing how his classes had taught him new leadership techniques and how he had taken on more responsibilities at work. The conversation felt natural, and for the first time, Jimmy felt like he was truly being seen for the hard work he had put in. At the end of the interview, Rachel smiled. "You've got a lot of potential, Jimmy. We'll be in touch soon." That night, as Jimmy walked home from the interview, he reflected on how far he had come. He had faced countless challenges, but each one had shaped him into someone stronger, someone capable of more. No matter the outcome of the interview, Jimmy had already proven something to himself: he had the strength to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles. A few days later, he received the call. The supervisor position was his. Jimmy's world shifted once again. He had been given the opportunity he'd worked so hard for, and it was only the beginning. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. And this was just the first step toward the life he had always dreamed of. As he hung up the phone, Jimmy realized that the key to his success hadn't just been about getting the job or the degree, it was about the perseverance, the belief in himself, and the willingness to take risks. He had shown himself that he was capable of much more than he had ever thought possible. It had only been a few days since Jimmy received the call offering him the supervisor position at the warehouse. He was still trying to process the news, but one thing was clear: his life had taken a huge turn. No longer was he just scraping by, working long shifts for minimum wage. He was now stepping into a leadership role, responsible for overseeing a team, managing operations, and making decisions that could affect the whole warehouse. The first morning of his new position, Jimmy arrived early. His heart was racing with excitement and nerves, unsure of what to expect. He had spent months preparing, taking courses, learning everything he could about warehouse management. But now, the weight of responsibility hit him all at once. What if he wasn't good enough? What if his team didn't respect him? He walked through the doors of the warehouse, and everything seemed the same. The familiar hum of machinery, the chatter of his coworkers, the smell of metal and wood, nothing had changed, except for him. He had taken a step into uncharted territory. Rachel, the HR manager who had interviewed him, greeted him with a warm smile as she handed him a set of keys to the office and the warehouse. "Congratulations again, Jimmy. You've earned this. We're all excited to see you take charge." "Thanks, Rachel," Jimmy said, taking the keys with a steady hand, though inside, he felt anything but steady. She gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "You've got this. Just remember to trust yourself." The first few days were a whirlwind. Jimmy's job as a supervisor wasn't just about overseeing the day-to-day operations of the warehouse, it was about leadership. He needed to establish trust with his team, communicate clearly, and make tough decisions quickly. His days were filled with problem-solving, delegating tasks, and managing conflicts. It was a lot, but it was also exactly what he had been hoping for. There were moments when he felt overwhelmed. There were workers who were skeptical of him, questioning his ability to lead, and moments when he doubted himself. But Jimmy remembered the lessons he had learned over the past months, especially the importance of resilience. He had faced worse challenges before, and if he could make it through those, he could make it through this too. One morning, as Jimmy was reviewing the schedule for the day, Carlos approached him with a concerned look. "Hey, man, you've been doing great, but there's a situation with John. He's been slacking lately, and it's starting to affect the team. I know you're trying to stay positive, but you need to address it." Jimmy paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation. John was a long-time employee, someone who had been with the company for years. It was difficult to balance the desire to be fair and supportive with the need to maintain discipline. Jimmy didn't want to be the boss who was too harsh, but he also knew that if he didn't address the issue, it would affect the whole team. "Thanks for bringing this up, Carlos," Jimmy said thoughtfully. "I'll have a word with him and see what's going on. We need to make sure the team stays on track." Later that afternoon, Jimmy found John in the break room, sitting by himself, scrolling through his phone. He took a deep breath and walked over to him. "Hey, John," Jimmy said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Can we talk for a minute?" John looked up, his expression guarded. "Sure, what's up?" "I've noticed a few things lately. You've been falling behind on your work, and it's starting to impact the team," Jimmy said, choosing his words carefully. "Is everything okay?" John sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know, man. I've just been going through some stuff lately. It's hard to keep up, and honestly, I don't feel like I'm getting the support I need." Jimmy nodded, understanding that there was more to the situation than he initially realized. "I get that. Life can be tough. But we're a team here, and if one person falls behind, it affects everyone. Is there something specific going on? Maybe I can help." John hesitated, then spoke quietly. "My mom's been really sick, and it's been hard to focus on anything. I've been coming in late some days, and I just haven't been feeling like myself." Jimmy took a moment to process what John was saying. He could feel the weight of the situation, but at the same time, he understood that his role as a supervisor wasn't just about productivity, it was about people. John wasn't just a worker, he was a person going through a difficult time. "I understand, John," Jimmy said softly. "I'm sorry to hear about your mom. I know it's not easy. Let's figure this out together. Maybe we can adjust your schedule for a bit to give you some more time or support you in another way. Just know that we're here for you." John's eyes softened, and he seemed to relax a little. "Thanks, man. I didn't know if I should talk about it, but I appreciate it." Jimmy gave him a reassuring smile. "No problem. We're all in this together. Just keep me posted if you need anything." As the weeks went by, Jimmy continued to face challenges as a supervisor. Some days were easier than others, but he learned valuable lessons with each experience. He had to balance the needs of the company with the well-being of his team. And though it wasn't always easy, Jimmy found a way to make it work. One afternoon, as Jimmy was walking through the warehouse floor, he noticed a few workers standing by a stack of boxes, looking frustrated. He approached them to see what was going on. "Everything okay here?" Jimmy asked, his voice steady but concerned. One of the workers, Mark, spoke up. "Yeah, there's a mix-up with the inventory. Some of the boxes are mislabeled, and we can't find the products we need." Jimmy took a quick look at the situation and immediately started making calls to the inventory department. Within minutes, he had the issue resolved. The workers looked relieved, and Jimmy could sense their appreciation. "Thanks, Jimmy. You really helped us out there," Mark said, offering a genuine smile. Jimmy smiled back, feeling a sense of pride. This was what leadership was about, making decisions quickly, solving problems, and helping people feel supported. The moment may have been small, but it was a victory. And it was those small victories that added up to something much bigger. At the end of the week, Jimmy received an email from Rachel. It was a simple message, but it carried a lot of weight. "Jimmy, I've been hearing great things about your work. You've really stepped up as a leader, and I just wanted to say that I'm proud of the progress you've made. Keep up the great work." Reading that message, Jimmy felt a rush of emotion. It wasn't just the recognition, it was the realization that he had truly earned his place in this new role. He had faced his fears, tackled the challenges head-on, and had grown in ways he never imagined. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. Jimmy had been settling into his new role as supervisor with a surprising level of ease. The challenges kept coming, but he was learning how to handle them one at a time. He had found a rhythm, balancing his job, his studies, and his personal life. He was building stronger relationships with his co-workers, and his leadership was starting to be recognized. For the first time in a long while, things seemed to be falling into place. But life, as it often does, had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected it. One crisp morning, as Jimmy walked into the warehouse, the usual buzz of activity felt off. There was an unusual tension in the air. The team was moving slower than usual, their voices quieter, their movements more hesitant. Jimmy's stomach knotted with the sense that something was wrong. He headed toward the break room, hoping for some clarity. Carlos was sitting at one of the tables, sipping his coffee. When he saw Jimmy walk in, his expression darkened. "Hey, Carlos. What's going on? Why does the floor feel like everything's about to go wrong?" Jimmy asked, trying to keep his voice light. Carlos looked up, sighing heavily. "There's been a big shakeup. Upper management is making some changes, some of them not so great for the rest of us." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "What kind of changes?" "It's the layoffs. They're cutting jobs, Jimmy. Some of the older guys who've been here for years, are being let go," Carlos said quietly, his voice tinged with frustration. Jimmy's chest tightened. He'd heard rumors of layoffs before, but he had hoped they were just that, rumors. Now, it was reality. People's lives were about to be upended, and Jimmy had no idea how to navigate the storm that was about to hit. As if on cue, Rachel walked in. Her usually calm demeanor was strained today. "Jimmy," she said, nodding at him as she joined Carlos at the table. "I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about some changes. It's not easy, but we're going to have to make some cuts. I wanted you to hear it from me first." Jimmy nodded, trying to steady his emotions. "I understand. But how do we handle this? How do I tell my team about it?" Rachel hesitated, then looked at him directly. "I'm going to be honest with you, Jimmy. I know this is hard, but these decisions come from the top. You'll need to be the one to talk to your team, keep morale up, and help manage the fallout. We'll need you to lead, especially now." Jimmy felt a sense of responsibility weighing down on him. He wasn't prepared for this. He had been so focused on excelling in his role, on growing as a leader, that he hadn't anticipated something like this. How could he help his team through this crisis? They had already been through so much, and now they were facing uncertainty. The rest of the day felt like a blur. Jimmy tried to keep things running as smoothly as possible, but his mind was constantly occupied with the looming layoffs. His co-workers, many of whom had become friends, were anxious. The warehouse floor felt quieter, more subdued. Even those who didn't seem directly affected were walking on eggshells, unsure of who would be next. That afternoon, he called a meeting with his team. It wasn't easy to get everyone gathered, many of them were still distracted by the news of the layoffs. As they filed into the break room, Jimmy felt the weight of his role. This wasn't just about managing logistics or making sure the boxes were stacked in the right place. This was about being there for his team during a difficult moment. He took a deep breath before he spoke, trying to find the right words. "Listen, I know things feel uncertain right now. We've all heard the rumors about layoffs, and I know that's weighing heavily on everyone. I want you to know that I'm here for you, and I'll be doing everything I can to make sure we get through this together," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. The room was quiet as his words settled in. He could see the concern in their faces, the worry that this would be the end of everything they had worked for. "I don't have all the answers right now, but I promise I'll do everything in my power to support this team. We're in this together, and that's what matters." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Mark, one of the more senior workers, stood up. He was in his late 40s, and his face was weathered with years of hard work. He wasn't the kind of guy to show a lot of emotion, but today, his eyes were serious. "You've been a good leader, Jimmy," Mark said quietly. "I know this isn't your fault. We appreciate you being straight with us. We'll figure this out." Jimmy nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. Mark's words meant more than he could express. It was moments like this, moments of real connection, that reminded him why he had taken this job in the first place. The next few weeks were a blur of uncertainty and stress. Jimmy had to deal with the fallout of the layoffs, managing not only the operations of the warehouse but also the emotional impact on his team. Some workers were offered new roles, while others were let go entirely. The atmosphere at work was heavy, and morale was low. But in the midst of all this, Jimmy found something unexpected: opportunity. One day, as he was reviewing the warehouse inventory with his team, Rachel approached him again. This time, her expression was different. She seemed more hopeful, though still serious. "Jimmy," she said, "I know this has been a tough time, but I wanted to talk to you about something. We've had some turnover recently, and we're looking at restructuring some positions. There's a new opportunity for someone to take on a larger leadership role. I think you'd be a great fit." Jimmy was taken aback. After everything that had happened, he hadn't expected this kind of recognition. He had barely been holding it all together, and now here was Rachel, offering him another challenge. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Absolutely," Rachel replied. "You've shown incredible resilience during this difficult time. You've kept your team together when everything was falling apart. I think you're ready for more responsibility." Jimmy's mind raced. He had come so far in such a short time. This new opportunity could be a turning point in his career, a chance to step up even further, to become a key player in the company. But with it came even more pressure, more responsibility. He wasn't sure he was ready for that. But then he thought about how far he had come. From being homeless to becoming a supervisor, to now being presented with this opportunity, it was a testament to his growth, his perseverance. He couldn't let fear hold him back now. "I'll do it," Jimmy said, his voice steady with resolve. "I'm ready." The news of his new opportunity hit Jimmy like a whirlwind. Just when he thought the dust had begun to settle, Rachel's offer to step into a larger leadership role threw him into yet another whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He had been pushing forward, taking on challenges one day at a time, never truly considering what might come next. But now, the future seemed to open up in front of him, filled with endless possibilities, and even more uncertainty. That evening, as Jimmy sat at his small kitchen table, the weight of the decision felt even heavier. The apartment, though humble, had become his sanctuary, the place where he could reflect and gather his thoughts. He had come a long way since those first few nights on the street. The man he was now didn't look much like the young boy who had once begged for food on the sidewalks. But that boy, that desperate part of him, was still in there somewhere. He had learned so much, not just about leadership and management, but about who he was, what he was capable of, and what he truly wanted. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and texted Carlos, "Can we talk?" Carlos had been with him through thick and thin, and Jimmy trusted him like a brother. If there was anyone he needed to talk to about this next step, it was him. Minutes later, Carlos replied, "Of course, man. I'll be there in 30. When Carlos arrived, Jimmy had a cup of coffee waiting for him. The two sat down at the table, and for a moment, there was silence. Carlos could tell something was weighing on his friend. "What's going on, Jimmy? You look like you've been hit with a ton of bricks," Carlos said, leaning back in his chair. Jimmy hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words. "Rachel offered me a bigger role," he said, finally breaking the silence. "A higher leadership position. I don't know what to do. I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "You're not sure? Dude, you've been killing it as a supervisor. You've handled the layoffs, you've kept your team together when everyone else was losing their minds. You've got this." Jimmy rubbed his forehead. "Yeah, I know I've been doing well, but this is different. This isn't just managing people on the floor. This would be a whole new level of responsibility. I'm scared I'm not ready for it." Carlos gave him a look of understanding. "It's okay to be scared. I mean, look at how far you've come. From homeless to supervisor, and now this? You've already shown more courage and leadership than most people will ever have. Don't let fear hold you back now." Jimmy let out a breath, his anxiety slowly subsiding. "I don't want to fail. What if I let everyone down? What if I can't handle it?" Carlos leaned forward, his tone serious. "Look, man. You've been through hell and come out the other side. You've learned to lead through empathy, through understanding. That's something most bosses can't say. And you don't have to be perfect. You just need to show up, do your best, and be the kind of leader who listens. You're ready for this." Jimmy sat back in his chair, letting the weight of Carlos's words sink in. He had always been his hardest critic, afraid of the unknown. But maybe Carlos was right. Maybe he wasn't meant to wait until everything was perfect. Maybe the best way forward was to take the leap, to step into the unknown with all the courage he had. "You're right," Jimmy said, nodding slowly. "I've already made it through so much. I can do this." The next morning, Jimmy walked into the warehouse with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let fear stop him now. As he passed by the workers on the floor, he smiled and nodded at them. They were still dealing with the aftermath of the layoffs, but there was a subtle shift in the air. Jimmy wasn't just a supervisor anymore. He was a leader, and his team was counting on him. Rachel called him into her office later that day to discuss the specifics of the new role. The position she was offering would require him to oversee several warehouses in the region, managing not just the day-to-day operations but also developing strategies for growth, improving efficiency, and even making hiring decisions. It was a huge leap from what he had been doing, but it also represented everything he had been working toward. The idea of having a broader impact, of influencing more than just one warehouse, sparked something in him that he couldn't ignore. "You've shown us that you can handle the responsibility, Jimmy," Rachel said, looking at him with confidence. "This position is a big step, but I think you're more than capable of handling it. I believe in you." Jimmy felt a mix of emotions: excitement, fear, uncertainty. But as he looked at Rachel, he realized that this wasn't just about the company or the role. It was about his own growth, his own journey. "I'm in," Jimmy said, his voice steady. "Let's do it." Rachel smiled, clearly pleased. "Great. We'll get started with the transition as soon as possible." Over the next few weeks, Jimmy began transitioning into his new role. There were a lot of changes to navigate, both in terms of responsibilities and relationships. As he managed multiple warehouses, he found himself juggling more tasks than ever before. But despite the overwhelming nature of the job, he never lost sight of the core values that had gotten him this far: honesty, empathy, and teamwork. One of his first major tasks was to revamp the training program for new employees. He had seen firsthand how important it was to invest in people, to help them grow and succeed. He didn't want to just be a boss who gave orders, he wanted to be a mentor, someone who helped others rise alongside him. He worked closely with his HR team to design a program that would foster both skill development and emotional intelligence, ensuring that new hires felt supported and valued from day one. But with new opportunities came new challenges. The pressure mounted as the expectations grew. Jimmy found himself questioning his decisions more frequently, unsure if he was doing the right thing for his team or the company. There were days when the weight of leadership felt almost unbearable. One afternoon, while meeting with the warehouse managers from other locations, Jimmy felt the burden of his role more heavily than ever. The stress was starting to take a toll on him, and for the first time since he had taken the job, he questioned whether he was truly cut out for it. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, Jimmy's mind raced. His thoughts were a tangle of doubts and fears. But then, he remembered something Carlos had said to him earlier: "You've already been through hell and come out the other side. You've learned to lead through empathy, through understanding." Taking a deep breath, Jimmy decided to do what he had always done when facing uncertainty: he would trust himself, keep moving forward, and ask for help when needed. He wasn't alone in this. And if he had come this far, he was capable of handling whatever came next. The days after his decision to embrace the new leadership role were some of the most intense and transformative moments of Jimmy's life. Every morning, he would wake up with a renewed sense of purpose, but the weight of his responsibilities felt heavier with each passing day. It wasn't just about managing a team anymore, he was now responsible for an entire network of warehouses. The scope of his job had expanded dramatically, and with that expansion came a growing pressure that was sometimes overwhelming. Jimmy had always thrived under pressure, but this was different. Now, he was juggling meetings with upper management, overseeing operational efficiencies, handling employee concerns, and keeping an eye on everything from logistics to budget. He had gone from being a team supervisor to being the man responsible for steering the direction of multiple locations. There were moments when it felt like he was drowning in his own to-do list, but at the same time, he felt a sense of pride and excitement that kept him pushing forward. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk reviewing some performance metrics, his phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "Got a minute? There's something I want to discuss." Jimmy frowned, setting his pen down. The last time Rachel had called him into her office, it was for something important, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety. He had just been through a tough meeting with a few managers about the upcoming seasonal ramp-up, and he was unsure whether they were making enough progress. "Of course," Jimmy texted back. "I'll be right there." When he entered Rachel's office, he found her sitting behind her desk, reviewing some documents. She looked up as he walked in, offering him a warm smile. "Hey, Jimmy. Have a seat," she said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. Jimmy sat down, his nerves tingling. He couldn't quite read the expression on her face. She looked calm, but there was an intensity in her eyes that made him feel like this conversation wasn't just about day-to-day operations. "I've been reviewing your progress," Rachel began, "and I have to say, I'm impressed. The changes you've implemented in such a short amount of time are already making a significant impact." You've really stepped up in ways I didn't expect. The team is more cohesive, the productivity is up, and overall, there's been a noticeable shift in morale. Jimmy couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. He had worked tirelessly to ensure that his teams were engaged and that operations were running as smoothly as possible. Seeing his efforts recognized was a reminder of how far he had come. "Thanks, Rachel," he replied, feeling the pressure lift a little. "It's been a lot of work, but I'm glad to see it paying off." Rachel paused for a moment, her expression turning more serious. "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you, Jimmy. I've been asked to put together a proposal for a leadership development program for the company, and I want you to help with it. They're looking at you to design a training curriculum that could be used across all our locations. Essentially, you'll be shaping how leadership is developed here." Jimmy blinked, taken aback by the request. "Me? But I've only been in this position for a few months. Don't you think I'm still learning myself?" Rachel leaned forward, her eyes steady. "Exactly. That's why you're the perfect person for the job. You've walked through the ranks, from the bottom all the way to leadership. You know what it takes to succeed in this environment. You've faced challenges that most leaders will never encounter, and you've learned how to manage not only operations but also people. The way you've navigated your own growth gives you a unique perspective on what works and what doesn't. That's what makes you the right person to guide others." For a moment, Jimmy was silent. He had never imagined himself as a mentor, let alone someone who could shape the development of future leaders. But there was something about the way Rachel spoke that made him feel both honored and nervous at the same time. He had always wanted to make a difference, but this was a responsibility he hadn't fully anticipated. "I don't know if I'm ready for that level of responsibility," Jimmy admitted, his voice filled with doubt. "It's one thing to lead my team, but shaping the future of the entire company's leadership? That feels huge." Rachel smiled, as if she had anticipated his hesitation. "I understand that it's a big step, but I know you have it in you. And you won't be doing this alone. We'll be here to support you every step of the way. This is a chance for you to make a lasting impact, not just on the company, but on the people who will be taking these lessons into their own careers." Jimmy's mind raced. He had always been the kind of person who hesitated to take on too much at once. The fear of failure had driven much of his past decisions. But now, after everything he had overcome, he realized that this was the next step in his journey. It was time to embrace his role as a leader, not just of his team, but of an entire culture of leadership within the company. "I'll do it," Jimmy said, the words coming out more confidently than he had expected. "Let's get started." The next few weeks were filled with brainstorming sessions, presentations, and countless hours spent developing the framework for the leadership program. Jimmy worked alongside Rachel and the HR team, drawing from his own experiences to shape a curriculum that would address the real challenges of leadership. They focused on teaching new leaders how to inspire their teams, how to manage conflict, how to prioritize well-being, and how to build trust, skills Jimmy knew were often overlooked in traditional leadership training. As he worked on the proposal, Jimmy found himself growing more and more excited about the impact this could have. He had always known that true leadership was about more than just giving orders. It was about understanding people, about recognizing their strengths, and about helping them grow. Now, he had the chance to instill those values into the very fabric of the company. But as the days wore on, the pressure began to mount again. The more he worked on the leadership program, the more Jimmy realized just how big of a shift this was for him. He wasn't just overseeing the day-to-day operations of the warehouses anymore. He was now contributing to something that could shape the future of the company, possibly for years to come. The weight of that responsibility was both thrilling and terrifying. One late night, after a long day of meetings and planning sessions, Jimmy found himself back in his apartment, sitting at his kitchen table with his laptop open in front of him. His mind was buzzing with ideas, but exhaustion was creeping in. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts. As he sat there, he couldn't help but think back to his early days spent wandering the streets, unsure of where his next meal would come from. He thought about the people who had helped him along the way, the ones who had given him a chance when no one else would. He thought about Carlos, about Rachel, about everyone who had supported him and believed in him even when he doubted himself. And for the first time in a long while, Jimmy felt a sense of peace. He had come so far. He had built something of his life, something worth fighting for. With that thought, Jimmy took a deep breath, closed his laptop, and stood up. Tomorrow was another day, a new chance to lead, to learn, and to make a difference. And he was ready for whatever came next. The following weeks felt like a blur. Jimmy was in constant motion, his time split between overseeing the warehouses, working with the HR team on the leadership program, and meeting with the executives to report on progress. His days were long, and the pressure was relentless, but somehow, he felt more alive than ever. Each challenge was an opportunity for growth, and he was determined to take them all head-on. One afternoon, as Jimmy sat in his office reviewing some key metrics, his phone rang. The caller ID read Carlos, and he quickly swiped to answer. "Hey, man, what's up?" Jimmy asked, trying to mask the exhaustion in his voice. Carlos chuckled. "You sound tired, Jimmy. Long day." "You could say that," Jimmy replied with a tired laugh. "Things are starting to pick up, and I've been juggling a lot. How's everything with you?" "Well, I wanted to ask you something," Carlos said, his tone becoming more serious. "I know you've got a lot going on, but there's something I think you should know." Jimmy's interest piqued. "What is it?" Carlos paused for a moment before continuing. "I'm hearing some whispers around the company. Some people are questioning your leadership, especially now that you've been promoted. A few of the other managers are starting to grumble, saying you're too new to be overseeing all of this. I think you need to know, in case it affects how you're viewed." Jimmy's stomach dropped. He had anticipated some level of skepticism, but hearing it from Carlos made it feel more real. "Are you serious?" Jimmy muttered, leaning back in his chair, suddenly feeling a sense of unease. "Yeah, man," Carlos said. "It's not everyone, but enough people are talking about it for you to know. They think you're not ready, that you don't have the experience. It's not like they're saying it to your face, but you know how it is." Jimmy took a deep breath, trying to process the information. For the first time in months, the familiar self-doubt crept back into his mind. What if they're right? What if I really am in over my head? He could feel the weight of the criticism in his chest. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about his team, his role, and the trust that Rachel had placed in him. If people didn't believe in his ability to lead, what did that mean for everything he had worked so hard for? "Thanks for telling me, Carlos," Jimmy said, his voice quiet but determined. "I'll handle it. Don't worry about me." Carlos could sense the shift in Jimmy's tone. "Are you sure, man? I know this can't be easy, especially with everything you've been doing. But I know you've got the chops for this. You're stronger than you think." Jimmy nodded, though Carlos couldn't see him. "I know. I just didn't expect it to come from the inside, you know. It's hard when the people you're working with question your ability." "I get it," Carlos replied. "But you've got the experience they don't see. They don't know where you've come from, the things you've had to fight through. If anyone can turn this around, it's you." Jimmy leaned forward, his resolve hardening. He had faced adversity his whole life, from being homeless to building his career from the ground up. He couldn't let these whispers take away the progress he had made. He would rise above this. He had no choice. The next morning, Jimmy woke up with a renewed sense of determination. He had faced countless challenges before, and this was just another one he needed to overcome. He wasn't about to let a few doubters derail everything he had worked for. When he arrived at the warehouse, he was greeted with the usual hustle and bustle of the operations floor. But today, something felt different. His eyes scanned the room, and he could sense the tension in the air. The murmurs were quieter now, but the whispers were still there, lingering just beneath the surface. It was time to take charge. Jimmy walked into the break room, where a few of the warehouse managers were gathered. He didn't waste any time getting to the point. "All right, I know there's been talk about my ability to lead," Jimmy said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend that I haven't heard the whispers. But what I will say is this: I'm not here because I don't deserve this position. I'm here because I've worked my butt off to get here. And I believe in all of you. I believe in what we can do together." There was a pause as the managers exchanged looks. Jimmy could see that some of them were skeptical, but he also saw others who were paying attention, who were listening. "I know I'm new to this level of responsibility," Jimmy continued, "but that doesn't mean I don't know what I'm doing. I've spent years in this company, working my way up from the bottom. I know what it's like to struggle, to feel like you're not being heard. I understand how important each and every one of you is to this company. And I will fight for you. I will support you. But I also expect the same from you. We're a team. And I'm not going to let us fail." There was a long silence after Jimmy finished speaking. The room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, one of the senior managers, Dave, spoke up. "You're right," Dave said, his voice surprisingly calm. "We've all got our doubts, but we've also seen what you can do. You've turned things around here. We may not always agree, but we respect the work you're doing. I'll stand by you." A few others nodded in agreement, and slowly, the tension in the room began to lift. Jimmy could feel the shift, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "Thank you, Dave," Jimmy said. "And thank you, everyone. Let's keep pushing forward, together." As he walked back to his office, Jimmy felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't easy facing those doubts, but he had confronted them head-on, and come out stronger for it. He knew this wouldn't be the last challenge he would face, but he also knew that with his team behind him, there was nothing he couldn't handle. Later that day, Rachel called him into her office again, her expression unreadable as he walked in. "Jimmy," she said as soon as he sat down, "I've heard what happened this morning. And I have to say, I'm proud of you. That was exactly what you needed to do." Jimmy's heart lifted. He had been nervous about how Rachel would react, but now, hearing her praise made everything feel worth it. "I won't lie," Rachel continued. "I know you're facing some internal resistance, but I also know you can handle it. You've proven yourself time and time again. You've earned your place in this position. And I'm not going to let anyone undermine that." Jimmy smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Thank you, Rachel. That means a lot to me." Rachel's smile was a little softer this time. "You're doing great, Jimmy. Don't let the challenges hold you back. Keep doing what you're doing, and the rest will fall into place." As Jimmy walked back to his office, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey he had been on. His past had shaped him into the leader he was today, and though there would always be obstacles to overcome, he knew now that he was more than capable of handling whatever came next. With a renewed sense of purpose, Jimmy looked ahead. The road to becoming the leader he wanted to be was still long, but he was ready to face it, one challenge at a time. Jimmy's life had been a constant series of challenges and triumphs, but now, for the first time in a while, he felt a real sense of stability. His confidence had grown stronger, and he was beginning to carve out a path as a leader, one he had once believed was out of reach. However, as he settled into his new role and gained the trust of those around him, he realized that leadership wasn't just about managing operations or overseeing teams. It was about lifting others up, helping them realize their own potential, and guiding them through their own struggles. And that was the challenge that loomed ahead. It was a Thursday afternoon when Jimmy first noticed Sarah, one of the newer warehouse managers. She had been with the company for a little over a year and was quickly rising through the ranks. However, there was something about her demeanor that stood out. While she was talented, smart, and driven, Jimmy sensed a hesitation in her. She seemed unsure at times, almost as if she was second-guessing herself. Jimmy had noticed her struggle in meetings to assert herself, especially when presenting her team's performance data. She often deferred to others, letting her ideas go unspoken, and he could tell that the weight of the role was beginning to get to her. As he watched Sarah fumble through a presentation in one of their team meetings, Jimmy's instincts kicked in. He knew what it felt like to be unsure, to feel like you didn't have the answers, and to be overwhelmed by the pressure. What he didn't realize was that, by now, he had become the person others turned to when they were in need of support. He was no longer just the person looking for answers, but the one helping others find theirs. After the meeting, Jimmy found Sarah standing by the whiteboard, wiping off the markers and looking lost in thought. He approached her quietly, giving her a moment before speaking. "Hey, Sarah," he said softly. "Can we talk for a minute?" She turned to him, her eyes flickering with surprise, though she quickly masked it with a smile. "Sure, Jimmy. What's up?" Jimmy took a deep breath. This wasn't an easy conversation, but he had learned that it was necessary. "I noticed something today during the meeting," he began, carefully choosing his words. "You've got great ideas, and your team is clearly doing well. But I also saw that you were holding back a bit. I know it can be tough when you're still finding your footing, but I want to make sure you know that you've earned your position here. You're more than capable of leading, and it's time you start believing that yourself." Sarah looked down, her face flushing. She didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, Jimmy wondered if he had overstepped. But then she sighed and spoke in a low voice. "I don't know, Jimmy," she said quietly. "It just feels like everyone else knows more than me. I mean, I'm still figuring things out, and sometimes I feel like I don't belong. There's so much pressure to be perfect, to be the one with all the answers." Jimmy smiled softly. He understood exactly how she felt. "I get it," he said, leaning against the desk. "When I was in your shoes, I felt the same way. I felt like I had to prove myself every single day. But the truth is, you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest, be willing to learn, and trust that the people around you want to see you succeed." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and skepticism. "But what if I mess up?" Jimmy chuckled. "You will. I promise you, you will mess up. And that's okay. It's part of growing. The key is not letting those mistakes define you. Learn from them, and use them as stepping stones. Don't let fear hold you back from taking risks and stepping into your power." Sarah paused, letting his words sink in. "I never thought of it that way," she said softly. "I guess I've been too worried about making a mistake. But you're right. I can't let that stop me." Jimmy placed a hand on her shoulder, offering reassurance. "I believe in you, Sarah. I know you've got what it takes. If you need support or guidance, I'm always here. But I want you to start believing in yourself, too." That afternoon, as Jimmy sat at his desk working through his usual stack of reports, he reflected on the conversation he had just had with Sarah. In many ways, he saw a younger version of himself in her, unsure, hesitant, but full of potential. And that realization made him reflect on his own journey. When he had first started at the company, no one had really taken the time to help him grow. He had stumbled through his early years, learning everything the hard way, and while it had made him resilient, it had also made him feel isolated. He never had a mentor who took him under their wing, offering guidance and reassurance. He had to find his own way, often failing more times than he would have liked. But now, he had the opportunity to change that. He could be the mentor he had never had, the person who helped others find their confidence, just as he had found his own. The next few weeks saw a noticeable shift in Sarah's approach. She began speaking up more in meetings, offering ideas and suggestions with greater confidence. Her team's performance steadily improved, and her colleagues started taking notice of her leadership. One afternoon, after a particularly productive meeting, Sarah approached Jimmy again. This time, her posture was more upright, her smile genuine. "Hey, Jimmy," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. I feel like I've finally found my rhythm. I know I still have a long way to go, but I'm starting to feel like I actually belong here." Jimmy smiled, a deep sense of pride welling up inside him. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. You're doing great. But remember, it's just the beginning. Keep pushing, keep growing. And don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything." As Sarah walked away, Jimmy stood there for a moment, reflecting on the impact of that conversation. Being a leader wasn't just about making decisions or overseeing operations. It was about helping others unlock their full potential, about showing them that they, too, could rise above their self-doubt and become the leaders they were meant to be. And in that moment, Jimmy realized that his purpose was clearer than ever. He wasn't just building a successful team or climbing the corporate ladder. He was helping others build their own futures. And that, to him, was the most rewarding part of all. Jimmy had come a long way since his early days at the company. He had faced countless obstacles, overcome personal struggles, and earned the trust of those around him. Now, as he stood in front of his team, ready to tackle a new challenge, he realized that the most important lesson he had learned was the power of trust, both in others and in himself. It was a bright Monday morning when Jimmy gathered his leadership team for a new initiative. They were about to launch a large-scale project that would stretch their capabilities, push their limits, and challenge every single one of them. The stakes were high, but Jimmy knew that the key to success was trust. Standing at the front of the conference room, he addressed the team with a determined look on his face. "This project is going to be our biggest yet," he began, "and we have everything it takes to make it a success. But the one thing we need more than anything else is trust. Trust in each other, trust in the process, and most importantly, trust in ourselves." His words resonated with the team, and as he looked around the room, he saw a mixture of excitement and apprehension on their faces. The project was ambitious, and they all knew that it wouldn't be easy. But Jimmy's confidence was contagious, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of unity within the group. "We're going to be tested," Jimmy continued, "but I know that we have the right people in this room. We all bring something unique to the table, and that's why this is going to work. I'm counting on each of you to trust in your own abilities and trust in each other. If we do that, there's nothing we can't accomplish." As the weeks went by, the project began to take shape. Jimmy worked closely with his team, offering guidance and support where needed. He saw the way they grew, individually and as a unit, overcoming obstacles and solving problems together. But as the project progressed, there were moments of doubt, moments when the pressure seemed too much to handle. It was in one of these moments that Jimmy's trust in his team was truly tested. Late one evening, as the team was finalizing the project's details, an unexpected issue arose. A critical part of the project, one that Jimmy had trusted another department to handle, had fallen behind schedule. The delay meant they would miss a crucial deadline, and the consequences could be disastrous for the company. Jimmy's stomach sank as he stared at the report. It was a tough pill to swallow. The pressure was mounting, and he knew that his team was relying on him to guide them through this setback. But for the first time, he felt the weight of leadership press down on him. His mind raced, but instead of giving in to panic, he took a deep breath and decided to lean on the trust he had built with his team. He called an emergency meeting with the department heads. As they gathered around the table, Jimmy stood before them, his face calm but resolute. "This is a setback," he said, "but it's not the end of the world. We're not going to let this define us. We've worked too hard, and we've come too far. I trust every one of you to help us find a solution. We can fix this, but it's going to take all of us working together." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone processed his words. There was no finger-pointing, no blame. Instead, there was a sense of shared responsibility. They were in this together. All right, one of the department heads said, breaking the silence. We'll rework the timeline. It won't be easy, but we can make it happen. We'll need extra hours, maybe a few adjustments on the resources side, but we can still meet the core objectives. Jimmy nodded, feeling the weight lift just a little. I know we can do it. Just remember, trust the process, trust each other. We're not alone in this. Over the next few days, Jimmy's team worked tirelessly to get the project back on track. They had moments of frustration, but there was a palpable sense of unity that kept them going. Each person knew they were responsible for something bigger than themselves, and that sense of purpose carried them through. When the project finally launched successfully, everyone in the room was exhausted but elated. The sense of relief and accomplishment was overwhelming. Jimmy stood at the front of the room, looking at the faces of his team, and he knew that this moment was a turning point. They had proven that with trust, collaboration, and determination, they could face any challenge together. As the team celebrated the success, Jimmy pulled Carlos aside, knowing that he had to thank him for his unwavering support. You were right, man, Jimmy said, his voice filled with gratitude. Trust really is the foundation of everything. I couldn't have done this without you. Carlos grinned. I told you, you're stronger than you think. And you've got a team that believes in you, Jimmy. That's what makes the difference. Jimmy smiled back, feeling a deep sense of pride in the people he had helped build around him. He had come so far, both personally and professionally, but he knew that the journey wasn't over. This was just another step towards something greater. That night, as Jimmy sat alone in his office reflecting on the day's events, he thought about the power of trust in leadership. He realized that leadership wasn't about being the smartest or the most experienced person in the room, it was about creating an environment where people felt safe enough to trust each other, to take risks, and to work together toward a common goal. As he looked out of the window at the city lights twinkling in the distance, Jimmy couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in how far he had come. He had once been a homeless child, uncertain of his future, struggling to find his place in the world. Now, he was leading a team of talented individuals, each with their own strengths, each with their own potential. And it was his job, not just to lead, but to empower, to help others realize that they, too, could rise above their doubts and achieve greatness. With a quiet smile, Jimmy closed his laptop and stood up, ready to face whatever came next. Jimmy's life had changed beyond recognition. From the streets of homelessness to a successful, respected leader at one of the biggest companies in the world, his journey had been nothing short of extraordinary. But as he stood in front of the largest and most challenging project of his career, he knew that this moment would be the true test of everything he had learned. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was immense, but there was no turning back now. The project was a global expansion for the company, one that would open new markets in Europe and Asia. It was a monumental task, one that required coordination across multiple continents, numerous departments, and a variety of external partners. The timeline was tight, and the resources were stretched thin. Everyone on the team had been working overtime, and tensions were running high. Jimmy stood at the front of the conference room, looking at his team. They had come so far, but now they were approaching the finish line, and the pressure was mounting. We're on the verge of something huge, Jimmy began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. This expansion isn't just about business. It's about proving that we, as a team, can achieve the impossible. But we need to stay focused. This is our final push. We've got to give it everything we've got, and we need to do it together. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I know it's been hard. I know we've hit some bumps along the way. But we've already proven that we can overcome anything. Now is the time to finish strong. As the team launched into their final stages of preparation, Jimmy found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. When he first started, he had been overwhelmed with self-doubt. He had no idea what he was doing or if he even belonged in such an important position. But as he had built trust with his team, learned from his mistakes, and grown as a leader, he had come to realize that leadership wasn't about perfection, it was about resilience, about learning, and about helping others grow. This project, the one that could make or break his career, was his chance to prove that to himself once and for all. But as he watched his team work tirelessly, Jimmy began to feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The risk of failure loomed over him, and despite all the progress they had made, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. It was the day before the final presentation to the board of directors, and Jimmy was exhausted. He had barely slept in the past week, his mind racing with every detail of the project. As he sat in his office late that night, going over the final reports, he received a phone call that made his heart drop. "Jimmy," Carlos's voice came through the phone, "there's a serious issue with the logistics team. They've encountered a major setback with one of our suppliers, and if it's not resolved, we're going to miss the launch date. The entire project is at risk." Jimmy's mind spun. The supplier issue was exactly the kind of thing he had feared. It was out of their control, and it could ruin everything they had worked for. "Is there anything we can do?" Jimmy asked, his voice tight with tension. "I'm on it," Carlos responded. "I'm going to get on the phone with them right now. I'll keep you updated." Jimmy ended the call and leaned back in his chair, his heart racing. This was the moment. This was the test he had been dreading. Could he remain calm and lead his team through yet another crisis? The hours that followed were some of the longest of Jimmy's life. He barely slept, spending every minute working with his team to find a solution to the supply chain issue. It was a race against time, and there was no room for error. Finally, just hours before the presentation, Carlos called with good news. After an intense round of negotiations, the supplier had agreed to expedite the delivery, and they would be able to meet the launch deadline. The project was back on track. Jimmy let out a sigh of relief, feeling the tension lift from his shoulders. But there was no time to rest. He knew that they still had to present their work to the board of directors, and they needed to do it flawlessly. The presentation was intense. The room was filled with some of the most powerful and influential people in the company, and every eye was on Jimmy as he stepped up to deliver the final report. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the pressure mounting with every second. But as he looked around the room at his team, standing by his side, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just his responsibility. It was their success, their hard work, and their dedication that had brought them here. He wasn't alone. Jimmy took a deep breath, steadied his nerves, and began the presentation. As he spoke, he felt the weight of his journey, his struggles, his triumphs, and the lessons he had learned, flow through him. This was the culmination of everything he had fought for. And as he looked out at the board members, he knew that he was ready. The presentation went smoothly, and the board of directors was impressed by the team's work. There were challenges, yes, but they had faced them head-on, and the results spoke for themselves. The expansion was a success, and the company was poised to grow in ways they had never imagined. As the meeting concluded, Jimmy stood by the door, feeling a sense of pride wash over him. His team had done it. They had pulled together, faced adversity, and delivered something incredible. And Jimmy had been there, leading them through it all. Carlos walked over to him, a smile on his face. "You did it, man. We did it." Jimmy smiled back, his heart full. "We did it. All of us." That night, as Jimmy sat alone in his office once again, he thought about how far he had come. He had been homeless, uncertain of his future, and now he was a leader who had guided his team through one of the company's most successful projects. He had trusted in himself and in others, and it had paid off. The road ahead was still long, but he knew one thing for certain: he was ready for whatever came next. As he left the office and stepped out into the cool night air, he looked up at the stars above. They seemed to shimmer, as if reflecting the light of all the hard work, the sacrifices, and the victories that had brought him here. And as he walked away, a sense of peace washed over him. He had proven to himself that no matter where you start, or what challenges you face, you can always rise. The journey was never easy, but with trust, determination, and the willingness to keep going, anything was possible. The sun was setting over the city, painting the skyline in hues of pink and gold. Jimmy stood at the window of his office, looking out at the world he had fought so hard to become a part of. The company's expansion had been a success, his team had been celebrated for their hard work, and everything seemed to be falling into place. But as he looked at the horizon, he knew that the journey was far from over. There was still more for him to do, more people to inspire, and more lives to change. For years, Jimmy had been driven by the desire to prove himself. He had started from nothing, homeless, without a plan, and with no clear path forward. But now, he stood at the helm of something far greater than himself. He had risen from the streets to lead a successful global project, and along the way, he had learned lessons that would guide him for the rest of his life. But as the final paperwork for the project was signed, and the celebrations in the office came to a close, Jimmy realized that the true reward was not the accolades or the promotions. It was the knowledge that he had helped others find their way, just as he had found his. A few days later, after the initial whirlwind of the project's completion, Jimmy found himself sitting down with his mentor, Carlos, at a quiet cafe in the heart of the city. The two of them had shared countless hours of hard work, brainstorming sessions, and moments of doubt over the years. But now, over coffee, they were reflecting on everything they had accomplished. "You've come a long way, Jimmy," Carlos said, taking a sip from his cup. "This success is yours, but it's also a reflection of the team you built. You've done something incredible." Jimmy smiled, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "I'm proud of what we accomplished, Carlos. But I can't help but wonder, what's next? I feel like there's still so much left to do, and I don't want to stop here." Carlos leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "That's the thing about success, it doesn't end. There's always another challenge, always another opportunity to grow. But the most important thing, Jimmy, is to remember where you came from. Never forget the struggles that shaped you. Use those lessons to help others find their way, just like you did." Jimmy nodded, the weight of Carlos's words sinking in. He had always been focused on climbing higher, reaching further. But now, he realized that true success wasn't about reaching the top. It was about lifting others as you climbed, and using your own experiences to guide them along their journey. The conversation with Carlos sparked something in Jimmy. He began to think about the young people he had met throughout his journey, the ones who were struggling, the ones who felt lost, the ones who didn't know how to break free from their circumstances. He had once been in their shoes, and now, he wanted to give back. Over the next few months, Jimmy started a foundation focused on providing mentorship and opportunities for underprivileged youth. It wasn't about giving them handouts, it was about showing them the way, offering guidance, and helping them believe in themselves the way Jimmy had learned to believe in himself. The foundation quickly grew, and Jimmy found himself speaking at schools, talking to young people who reminded him of his younger self. He shared his story with them, not as a tale of success, but as a story of struggle, growth, and resilience. He wanted them to understand that no matter how hard life seemed, they could always rise above it. One day, while visiting a local high school to speak with a group of students, Jimmy met a young girl named Maya. She was shy, unsure of herself, and her eyes reflected a sadness that reminded him of his own youth. After his speech, she approached him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Jimmy, how did you keep going when everything felt impossible?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jimmy smiled warmly, remembering how he had felt all those years ago when he had no hope and no direction. He kneeled down so that he was eye level with her and said, "Maya, I've been where you are. I know what it feels like to think that things will never get better. But here's what I want you to remember, you are stronger than you know. Every challenge you face is an opportunity to grow. When it feels like everything is falling apart, that's when you need to hold on tight and keep going. There is always a way forward, no matter how dark it seems. Maya looked at him with wide eyes, a spark of hope beginning to light up in her heart. "Do you really believe that?" she asked, her voice full of doubt. "I do," Jimmy said, nodding. "I didn't get here on my own. There were people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And now, it's my turn to believe in you. You can do anything you set your mind to." The conversation with Maya stuck with Jimmy. It reminded him of why he had started his foundation in the first place. He wanted to give people like her the tools to succeed, to show them that their past didn't define them, and that their future was full of endless possibilities. As the months passed, the foundation continued to thrive, helping countless young people find their footing in life. Jimmy felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing that he was making a difference, not just in the corporate world, but in the lives of individuals who needed it the most. Looking back on everything he had accomplished, Jimmy knew that his journey was far from over. There would always be new challenges to face, new obstacles to overcome. But he was ready. With the lessons of the past guiding him, and the trust of his team and the young people he mentored, Jimmy felt a sense of purpose that was stronger than ever before. He had come full circle, from a homeless child with no direction to a successful leader and mentor who now had the power to change lives. And as he looked forward to the future, he knew one thing for certain: the greatest success wasn't in what he had achieved, but in how many others he could help achieve their dreams. The road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but Jimmy was ready to walk it, one step at a time, with his head held high and a heart full of hope. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?